This is our last day looking at the U.S. occupation of Japan, so we're going to finish with this question that we've been looking at. Was the U.S. occupation of Japan largely beneficial or detrimental? And hopefully we'll have some answers to that by the end. So we're going to just mention briefly about reconstructing Japan, the U.S. plan generally, and then we'll look at U.S. attempts to help the country recover economically, and then this transition again to its independence and the alliance between the U.S. and Japan. So we've already looked at this. The United States, first and foremost, wanted to punish the Japanese for what they had done during World War II, and then they wanted to reform the country from the top down to prevent that kind of tragedy from happening again. So we looked at the Tokyo War Crimes Trial, 46 to 48, which overlaps a little bit with economic recovery, but it began in 46 during this period of punish and reform, and then the Constitution in 1947 right at the end of this period of reforming the country. Now we're going to look just at economic recovery and then independence and alliance. So looking at economic recovery, I have some pictures I want to show you. And you can see this is the Japan that people had to go back to after the war. This is in Yokohama. You can see a Japanese citizen who is going back to his home, and there's really nothing left. You can see the images here, what he's using, trying to remember where his home used to be. This is a water spigot right here, a wash basin. So there's just nothing left. Even if you survived the war, there's nothing left to go back to. Americans have a hard time, sometimes they have a hard time imagining this, because the last war fought on U.S. soil was the War of 1812. I mean, Americans for generations now have not had to experience the devastation of war in the continental U.S. So this is what people had to come back home to. This Japanese person has nothing left to come back home to. Homelessness was rampant throughout cities and areas where the Americans had been bombing. People don't have home because their homes have been bombed. And so you can see here buses. These are disabled buses that homeless people are trying to convert into makeshift homes. And you can see that is not an ideal place to live, but they're desperate. They don't have a home. Even if these individuals know how to build a home, they don't have any materials. They don't have any raw materials to lay a foundation, to use wood to construct walls. They just don't have any of that. So a lot of devastation after the war. Now, slowly, the country begins to rebuild. This is Hiroshima in 1946, so this is 1 year after the atomic bomb is dropped. I don't know exactly where this is in relation to the bomb's detonation, where the hypocenter was. Sometimes students have asked, well, what about the effects of radiation? You're not supposed to go back to an area that's infested with radiation, where you can get infected with radiation. And I don't know exactly where this is, but it might hopefully be far enough away. But most people in 1946, even in 1945, did not really understand how radiation can affect a person's body, the health, the human cells. But I want you to see there are some buildings. You can see outlines of buildings here at the bottom around these roads. So things are rebuilding very slowly. But again, it has to be slowly because there aren't any materials really to help people rebuild. This image also depicts this. You can see the rubble on the left, and on the right-hand side, there are new structures going up. Nevertheless, this is the country that Japanese people are going back home to, the ones who survived. Now, in the United States point of view, this is a horrible crisis, and they want to stop the humanitarian tragedy here. So this is what's often called the reverse course policy. So by 1947, the country, the United States, decided we need to try to help these people rebuild economically. We've got to get them back on their feet. We've got to feed them and make sure they're okay so they can survive and rebuild this country. So this is an image of a woman with a ration book. Everybody gets a certain amount of rations, and she's going to one of these administrative offices where they hand out beans. You can see she's carrying a baby on her back. This gentleman here is holding a glass container. So people would come for beans, and they would, for their ration, they'd also come for clean water because they couldn't get it anywhere else. But you can see the general mood of these people. This child here, this parent, and other individuals back here. They don't look happy. They look very sad and defeated. And the United States felt a need to help with this humanitarian crisis, but also didn't want to just give handouts. They wanted to also try to help rebuild the Japanese economy. One of the things they would do is open up job opportunities in these factory settings. Here are some Japanese women who have been helping to construct and put together clocks. And so these clocks are going to be exported to places in the West, and that will allow the Japanese to import the things that it needs. There were 34 Japanese factories produced by 1946, and 123,000 clocks being created. So trying to do something to help the economy rebuild. So reverse course. I needed to address the shortages of food and raw materials. That was a huge priority. The United States also helped to change the taxes, reform tax policy so that you could try to curb and control inflation. If the price of goods and services just keeps going up, then people can't afford to purchase those things. So those are two examples. The biggest example that helped Japan's economy recover was the Korean War. Point blank, that's it. The Korean War helped more than anything else. And I want you to notice, I'll move my head out of the way again so you can see this. Economic recovery period begins around 1947 and it ends in 1950. Well, when does the Korean War begin? June 25th, 1950. This is not a coincidence. The Korean War helped to jumpstart Japan's economy more than anything else. Some scholars will say that really it's the Korean War that saved Japan. That's maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but it is important to note that the Korean War helped so much with Japan's economy. And so Japan became the primary supply depot for the United Nations forces, the United States in particular. So here's an image of the U.S. 25th Infantry Division. They are loading up at Japanese ports, and then they're going to take off to Korea. So obviously it helped the United States to have Japan there so close to Korea to be able to wage war more quickly in Korea. I wanted you to look at a couple of documents for today, Independence and Alliance from about 1950 to 1952. So if you looked at the reading, you would have noticed that there's something called the San Francisco Peace Treaty or San Francisco System, and this took place in 1951. There are two parts here. So the first part, the Treaty of Peace between Japan and 48 other nations. So first and foremost, the Japanese have to have a peace treaty with all of the nations it waged war with during World War II. And then the United States pressured Japan, essentially forced Japan into a separate peace treaty, which we looked at to read for today, which is the Bilateral Security Treaty between the U.S. and Japan. So this is a very important document because it creates a framework for the relationship between the U.S. and Japan for decades to come, a relationship that still exists today. And that treaty was in 1951. It was renewed in 1960. And so we look at these two treaties together because there are a lot of similarities between them in this nine-year period. So think about, as you read this treaty, or these two treaties, you can read them in tandem. Think about, are these treaties consistent with Article 9 of Japan's 1947 Constitution? Go back and look at Article 9. What does that say in Japan's Constitution, a constitution that the U.S. essentially wrote for the Japanese? How would you characterize Japan's relationship with the U.S. under these treaties? who really benefits from these treaties, from these agreements? Who's really benefiting from these agreements? Is it the Japanese? Is it the U.S.? Is it someone else? This is an image of the Prime Minister of Japan signing the Bilateral Security Treaty with the U.S. in 1951. And these are Americans in the background here who are watching him getting ready to sign. This is another Japanese politician here who later becomes Prime Minister in 1960. But this is a momentous occasion. They're taking pictures and people are smiling and happy that is taking place. And this just shows you an image of all the U.S. bases that are in Japan. So you can see all these Navy bases. Just look at the red dots. All these naval bases and air stations here that are in Japan that are where the U.S. forces are still today. The great majority of the bases are in Okinawa. So site of more than 75% of the U.S. bases are here in Okinawa. I took this map from back in 2011 whenever there was a massive earthquake in Japan. So it's actually showing you also where the massive earthquake was that affected the Fukushima nuclear facility. But nevertheless, that's beside the point. Look at the bases because that's what I'm trying to emphasize here. If you look at the very bottom of the second treaty between the U.S. and Japan, you will have noticed that it was signed by Douglas MacArthur II. That is not Douglas MacArthur's son. It's Douglas MacArthur's nephew. And so it's interesting that this guy's parents named him after his uncle, Douglas MacArthur. And whenever the peace treaty went into effect in 1960, the second one, he made the cover of Time magazine. It was a very important day in world history. So you have these separate treaties between Japan and 48 other nations. Then you have this bilateral security agreement between U.S. and Japan. It's renewed in 1960. Why? Why is the U.S. so determined to have this alliance between Japan and the U.S.? And you have to think about the context of things that were happening at that time. The Korean War, of course, is an important point. But even before that, it was fear of communism, fear of the spread of communism. The U.S. was way more concerned with the spread of communism than it was with a sort of rearmed or remilitarized Japan, because essentially the U.S. is going to serve as Japan's military, and Japan's going to create its own self-defense forces. So the USSR tested its first atomic weapon in 1949. That's in August. 2 months later, well, not even really 2 months later, a little bit more than a month later, the Chinese Communist Party announced the creation of this People's Republic of China. The communists won in China by near the end of 1949. So it's not a coincidence that the U.S. really wanted to have a strong, stable presence in Japan. They don't want Japan to fall to communism in the same way that China did, and they're afraid the USSR is becoming a stronger global power. But do think about this. The Allied occupation ended in 1952, but given these security treaties between the U.S. and Japan, what did that ultimately do to Japan's relationship with the rest of Asia? And as one historian described it, honestly, by forcing Japan into this close alliance with the United States and the West, it antagonized Japan, or it sort of it created an awkward situation for Japan with the rest of East Asia, so that relationship was never close between Japan and other places in East Asia, whether it was Korea, which had been a country that Japan annexed, or Taiwan, or China. So, nevertheless. So think about that big question. Was the U.S. occupation of Japan beneficial or detrimental? And then talk about that on the discussion board. Our portfolio assignment, the second part of this is coming up here. So do be thinking about a current event that you want to look for that's related to Japan. And you need to provide context for that the same way you did with the one on China. I will read those. I will give you feedback, and you'll be able to polish it up before the final one that's due at the end of the course. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have for today. Have a great day. I will see you next time.